In a world that shifts, God remains the same. Our yearly theme for 2025 is the certain God for uncertain times. This is based on the text of James chapter 1 and verses 16 and 17. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Good morning. Good to see you all here today. Good to see two in particular back from the other side of the world. I'm, along with everyone here, anxious to hear how that trip went. I did get an email through the church website from a resort in Marinduque saying we're trying to get a hold of Mason Scott Young. He still owes us money. Guess they might have gotten in the mini fridge for Diet Cokes or something and they upcharged you, but excited to hear about the brethren and the work that's being done over there and the men we support in the preaching of the gospel. But good to see you back all in one piece. It is the first Sunday of the month, and I want to come back to our yearly theme, which is the certain God for uncertain times. And without getting into the scriptural basis for this theme, I just want to focus on the image. John put together the logo and just the image up there on the screen for you, and I gave him a little bit of feedback, and we were talking about some different images, visual representations that would convey the heart of the message about having a certain God. And for me, at the core of this concept, the certain God in uncertain times is, yes, we could look at the uncertainty of the world we live in and all the things that change, that come and go, that we can't depend on, but by contrast, we see God as this immovable mountain. And I recommended mountain would be a North Star, doesn't move, and there are some other things that would fit, but the mountain to me really encompasses the idea of this yearly theme that we want to emphasize in our personal care groups that meet every other month, that we want to emphasize in sermons throughout the year, and incorporate in other ways as well. This idea that God is like a mountain. God does not change. God is immovable. That's what makes him certain. And so this morning, in conjunction with preaching on our yearly theme, I just want to talk about some of the mountains that we see in the Bible, some stories related to mountains, make some observations, and draw your attention towards this illustration that God is like a mountain. God is solid. Mountains are very important in so many different ways. Just day-to-day life. They become, and every now and again, we get a clear day and we're reminded that we actually have good mountains here. You just can't always see them. I was so spoiled living in Salt Lake City for 10 years that even after 10 years, I would still try and take pictures of the mountains at just the right lighting as the sun was setting, and pictures would never capture it, but I still kept trying. And I really got spoiled there, seeing those beautiful mountains, but they're geographical landmarks. So they're very important, especially in generations past. They would be how you would navigate the land as you would find your way to a mountain, and that would be a major point along the way. And of course, even in modern times, we see snowpacks up in the mountain are very important for what kind of summer we're going to have as far as availability of water. So mountains are incredibly important, and we use mountains in just day-to-day expressions or idioms. I've got a mountain of work piled up on my desk, or I'm under a mountain of debt. Hopefully that's not you, but we've all been there, and we know what that feels like. It feels like an immovable object. We might describe someone like Shaquille O'Neal as a mountain of a man. So mountains are very significant in so many different ways. And I will emphasize the amateur aspect of this, but I fancy myself something of a mountain climber, and I enjoy climbing mountains, and the perspective of being on a mountaintop is unique. And if you've never hiked to the top of some sort of, even just a hill or some sort of prominent feature, you're really missing out. It's incredible to get that kind of perspective, especially the bigger mountains you get to. What makes mountains so special? Well, first of all, they're a place of refuge. Many people in the Bible have turned to the mountains in seeking refuge, both good guys and bad guys. In Joshua chapter 14, We notice here that something you learn from watching Star Wars, the high ground gives you an advantage in conflict. Joshua chapter 14 and verse 12, Caleb, remember he was along with Joshua, one of the faithful spies. Joshua looked at the hill country and said, I want this mountain. Joshua chapter 14 and verse 12, now give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke in the day, for you heard in that day how the Anakim, those are giants, or maybe not literal giants physically, but they're men of great stature. They were there and that the cities were great and fortified. It may be that the Lord will be with me and I shall be able to drive them out as the Lord said. You got to love it. Caleb's an old man at this point and he says, I don't want the easy part of the promised land. Give me that mountain there. I'll go conquer that mountain. The Lord will give it to me. Even years later, decades later, he still shows that same confidence in God. But it talks about how the mountain would be a difficult thing to conquer without God's help, because they would have the high ground. And likewise in Judges chapter 6, the Midianites were a problem for Israel. Of course, God would raise up an enemy to humble them when they would turn to idols or turn to sin. And so the Midianites are someone that God stirred up against them, and they would come and raid their lands and steal things. But it says in chapter 6 and verse 2 that the children of Israel made for themselves the dens, the caves, and the strongholds which are in the mountains. That's where they would go and hide. They offered a place of refuge and security. But also in Matthew 24, got to get some New Testament references as well. In Matthew chapter 24, we look at an example of Jesus here. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 16. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. In this context, Jesus is warning about the coming destruction against Jerusalem. It says, when you see it surrounded by armies, know that its judgment is at hand, and you better run to the mountains, because that's the only place you'll be safe. Mountains offer a refuge. Mount Oreb. And I'm going to talk about Mount Oreb and Mount Sinai. We'll just, for purposes of this sermon, we'll say that they are the same thing. Mount Oreb and Mount Sinai. It's a very interesting study right there, why Deuteronomy tends to favor Oreb as the name, whereas Exodus tends to almost exclusively favor Sinai as the name, but it seems to indicate the same place. And so in 1 Kings chapter 19, we'll come back to Mount Carmel, another great mountain story in the Old Testament. But after Elijah's standoff with the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, he goes to Mount Oreb because Jezebel wants to kill him. And so in chapter 19 and verse 8, so he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Oreb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And that's where he basically gives into despair. He says, I alone am left, and I can't take this anymore. It'd be better to just take me off this earth right now, end my life right now. But he went to Oreb, this mountain, as a place in a cave, as a place to find some sort of refuge from Jezebel that was hunting him down. Similarly, in Genesis 8, after the flood, another famous mountain, Mount Ararat, or the mountains of Ararat, if it's not a specific peak, the ark settled on it. It rested there. It found refuge after the great flood. So mountains are known for being places of refuge. And you got to love this one in John chapter 6. I know exactly what Jesus means, or what John means when he says this about Jesus. John chapter 6 and verse 15. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountains by himself alone. Even if it's not for your physical safety, mountains offer a place of refuge just mentally and emotionally. Go take a hike is one of the best bits of advice you could ever get, even though people don't often mean it in that context. Going out and being in nature, receding from people and stress and all kinds of things gives you clarity of thought, gives you a refuge from the things that are distressing or troubling you. And so for many reasons, in many ways, we see stories in the Bible where mountains are thought of as places of refuge. And they're always there. They're always there. And that's something I think of, again, relating this back to our great God and the idea that He does not change. Mountains don't change. Now, look, okay, volcanoes, I know. Any metaphor, if you stretch it too far, will fall apart. So I get that. But generally speaking, mountains don't change. They say that Everest is raising up in height by 1 inch every couple of years or something like that. Okay, technically, sure. But realistically, mountains don't change. They're always there. They're dependable. Mountains are strong. They possess a great power. And people need to recognize this. So, like I said, my experiences in climbing mountains are mostly in a previous decade of my life. I haven't done it in a while. And largely it centers around me reading books about mountaineering. And I understand that those that have died on mountains had a certain arrogance. Not always, but there's some randomness up there. But oftentimes it's people that went against their gut instinct or went against the warnings and tried to conquer the mountain anyway. You can summit a mountain if it allows you to summit. You can conquer a mountain only if it permits you to reach the summit that day. There are so many weather conditions, so many factors that you cannot control. So one of my experiences was Mount Hood just outside of Portland, Oregon. And that was one that you got deep crevasses in the glaciers that if you fall down, they're not finding your body ever. So we had to take safety precautions. I went with someone that did safety and rescue with the Army. We were roped up together, had big spikes on our boots and helmets and ice axes and all that. And we started at midnight, and as the sun was coming up, we were just a couple hundred feet from the summit. So close. And sometimes in the Cascades, you get these halo clouds, where it's clear blue skies everywhere else, but at the peak of the mountain, there's a halo of clouds. And I couldn't see from me to the next guy. I couldn't see 5 feet in front of me. And we were so close to the top. But mountains have that strength about them. And we just knew it wasn't letting us get to the top that day. We could have made it, but it was also dangerous enough. We could have just walked right over the edge of something and not known it. We could have walked right into a crevasse or something like that. It was not worth it. But I know that mountain's still there. I can go back and climb it some other time. It's still there. But mountains have this strength. They're imposing. I mean, they take up the visual landscape. And like I said, when we get clear weather out to the east, it's a wall of mountains out there with the Sierras, and they dominate our view because they have this, image of strength and power. And a great comparison is Mount Sinai, Exodus chapter 20. You could read that. For the sake of time, we won't this morning. But just think about what's described there as this cloud of smoke put a boundary around the mountain, and the earth was shaking, thunder, lightning, and flashes, and just loud booming noises. And you know what the people of Israel, what their reaction was? Moses, you go there. We're going to stay back here. Why did God need a mountain to do this? I won't say that he needed it, but is there a coincidence why many of these great stories take place on mountains? Because we're meant to make these connections, that mountains are physically imposing. Even a small hill can be physically exhausting to get to the top, let alone a giant mountain. So they're just this image of strength and power. 1 Kings chapter 18 is where you have this standoff. 450 prophets of Baal. Elijah calls them out at Mount Carmel, and they have this challenge. They each get a bowl, and they prepare it and prepare an altar, and all day long they're there calling for Baal, calling for their gods, and nothing happens. And he starts mocking them. Oh, is your God on a vacation? Has he taken a little break? Where is he? And then he wets his altar, soaks it so there's trenches of water around it, and calls down fire, and God rains down fire from heaven, and all the people kind of wake up from it and say, well, the Lord God, forget about Baal, that's the real God. And so he takes the 450 prophets and executes them there. And it was a great moment of victory, and it took place on a mountain. And so we see that God's strength is often displayed in these mountain stories. Mountains, and this is just kind of obvious too, mountains are really tall. They dominate the landscape. We see them from whenever I drive up to Oregon. It's like I feel like for almost like 2 hours of the trip I can see Mount Shasta, either in my in my windshield or in my rearview mirror. It's visible for such a long time because it's so big. And when you get higher up in elevation, God doesn't literally live up in the sky. But that's the idea that man has always had in their brains, going all the way back to the Tower of Babel. You build up into the clouds to get nearer to God. It isn't literally true, but conceptually we get the idea. And again, I'll just ask you, why are so many stories in the Bible, why do they have the setting of a mountaintop? Stories where people encounter God. Genesis chapter 22, Mount Moriah. And for sake of time, I'm not reading many of these stories because for most of us they're familiar, but I'll put the scriptures up there if you want to write them down and go read the texts later. But in Genesis 22, Abraham, take your son, your only son, and I want you to offer him up as a sacrifice. Go to the place I'll show you, and after a couple days' journey, they arrive at Mount Moriah. And that's where God stopped him at the very last moment and says, now I know that you believe in me. You will not withhold your only son. And there was the substitute, the ram, and they offered the ram, and it was a foreshadowing of Jesus on the cross. A great story that demonstrated the genuineness of Abraham's faith. And that was an encounter with God. And 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 1 says specifically, this is the place where the temple would be built generations later. And it's not this great mountain where we're thinking something like the Sierras out there. It wasn't some ginormous mountain, but it was a notable land mass. It was a distinguishable mountain to them. And it's where the temple was. And the temple is the place where God dwelt. When you needed to pray and have God hear, you would come to the temple and know God was there to listen to you. When you had a sacrifice to make, when on the Day of Atonement every year they would offer a sacrifice for the sins of all the people, this is the place they would come to. This is where they in their minds, you were not anywhere nearer to God than at Mount Moriah. And then, of course, we get Mount Sinai. Exodus chapter 34. I mean, really, the whole second half of the book of Exodus is kind of in this setting where Moses is receiving the Ten Commandments, the law, all those elements of it. In Exodus 34, Moses wants to see God. And that's a text that never has made sense to me. God says, you can't see me and live, but I'll cover you with my hand, and as I pass by, you can see my back. I didn't know God had a back. But that's what he says. And Moses comes down from the mountain still glowing, and all the people are shielding themselves from how brightly he shines. And Paul even talks about that in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. That's a really neat text where he references the secondhand glow, that God's presence was so magnificent that it still reflected in Moses even after he came down from the mountain. But that's an incredible story where where Moses was nearer to God than any other man. He saw more of the glory of God, and it took place on a mountain. And probably the most significant one would be Matthew chapter 17, the Transfiguration. And in Matthew chapter 17, it tells us that Jesus wanted to reveal his glory. He wanted to have this impression, leave an impression on Peter, James, and John, exactly who he was. In Matthew chapter 17, he led them up on a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as the light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. And this had such an impact on Peter. If you jump forward to 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter talks about this as, you want to know why I believe and why I sacrifice everything to be an apostle, and why I continue to preach this message even though it's probably going to result in my death? Because I saw the glory of God through Jesus on this mountain. In 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter references this encounter, for we did, in verse 16, we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received from God the Father honor and glory when such a voice came to him from the excellent glory, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And we heard this voice which came from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain." This moment had such an impact on Peter's life that he never forgot it. It's what confirmed his faith and solidified his faith, that this is not just a prophet, this is not just another person like us. This is the fullness of deity. When he heard the voice from heaven make that declaration. So we have many stories where people had a face-to-face encounter, if you will, with God on mountains. So, just the fact that people throughout time have viewed them as spiritually significant places because you're higher up. That's not literally true, but we definitely see that concept in the Bible. And mountains offer clarity. You watch some survival shows like Bear Grylls or whatever, and if you don't know where you are, there's a prominent land feature, a hill or a mountain, you can go up a little ways and get some perspective. Maybe you'll see a highway that you couldn't see at ground level through the trees. Mountains just offer a great perspective. One of my favorite times in Utah is at the top of one of these mountain peaks in the Wasatch Mountains was a weather station. You could see it look like a giant golf ball up on top of the mountain. And me and my buddy drove up there once and spent the night up there and camped out. We could see on the backside to the Cache Valley. We could see the Salt Lake Valley. We could see pretty much pinpoint, well, that's about where my house is. It's one of those lights over there. It was just incredible to be up that high and then to get up above the light pollution and see just an incredible night sky. So mountaintops offer clarity, and many stories reflect this as well. Mount Sinai, as I've referenced many times now, that is where God revealed the law to Moses, who then delivered it to the people of Israel. It was a time of clarity where God's word was confirmed, his laws, his expectations were written down and written in stone for that matter. At Mount Nebo, when Moses was nearing the end, although he didn't look 120 years old, it says he still had strength, vigor, had great eyesight still at that age. But his time was up, and God says, "Come up to Mount Nebo, and you can look out over the promised land. You can see it from up here. You will not get to go in or take possession of it personally, but you can come up and see." It was a point of seeing. And how many times did Jesus, and there's just some simple logic to this. There's a reason why you guys are sitting down and I'm up on a raised podium. It makes it easier for you to see and hear what's going on up here. And that's why Jesus would often go up on a hill or a mountainside to get an elevated position, to be able to speak out and teach to other people. But it can't be coincidence that so many of these great sermons, Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, doesn't tell us which mountain, but it's from an elevated position where Jesus offered some of the most clarifying teaching ever preached. And then Matthew chapter 24, we call it the Olivet Discourse, the Mount of Olives. And Jesus had this railing condemnation of the Pharisees and the Jewish leadership, and then also a warning about coming judgment on the city of Jerusalem. And it's the same place, apparently, in Acts chapter 1, where Jesus met his apostles and disciples and then ascended into heaven. So mountains are also a place of clarity. Let me see if I can tie all these stories together in a significant way as we wrap up the lesson. What does this all mean to us? Well, in the Old Testament, we get references to Zion or Mount Zion, and it has a little variance in its meanings. It can mean specifically the temple area, or it could be a word that stands in as describing Jerusalem as a whole, the whole city. So it's kind of used interchangeably in a couple of those different ways. Psalm 87, for example. But if you've ever wondered what Mount Zion is, just keep that in mind. It's kind of a stand-in for Jerusalem, or it might specifically be talking about the location of the temple. Psalm 87 and verse 2. The Lord loves the gates of Zion. Well, his foundation is in the holy mountains. The Lord loves the gates of Zion. More than all the dwellings of Jacob, glorious things are spoken of you, O city of God. So you see mountains and city both reference. Gates is kind of the language of a city here. But he talks about how his foundations is in the holy mountains. So it works on a couple of different levels to talk about it. But I think most importantly, though, when we see some of the great prophecies of the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 2, that's where Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, a statue, head of gold, arms of silver, and then you go bronze, and then iron and clay for the feet. And he's puzzled by this until Daniel is brought to him, and Daniel can interpret his dream for him and says, your dream represents 4 successive kingdoms. You, Nebuchadnezzar, in Babylon are the head of gold. It's what's going on right now. After you will rise another kingdom. And each kingdom, though it gets perhaps bigger or stronger in some ways, it also becomes less valuable and material. And in Daniel chapter 2, he says that something is going to happen in the days of that 4th kingdom, which historically we would identify with Rome. And so in Daniel chapter 2, notice what he says here in verse 34. As Daniel interprets this dream, you watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. Do you get the message here? God conquers the kingdoms of this earth, no matter how big or scary they are. God conquers them and blows them away like chaff, like they're nothing. But notice how verse 35 ends. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And reading on ahead just a little bit in verse 44, and in the days of these kings, that is Rome, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms. It shall stand forever. There's your unchangeableness. Inasmuch as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. God would establish this great mountain. Isaiah chapter 2, if you go back a few generations to Isaiah chapter 2, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills. All nations shall flow to it. Many people shall come in and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So you combine some of these elements here, and this prophecy is about a great mountain. It's not hard to find. God is not hiding what he's doing. You don't hide a mountain. It becomes something that everyone can see from miles and miles away, from all over the earth, and stream to it. If you want to learn about God, you go to his mountain. Zion of prophecy. And what we see in correlation to that, Hebrews chapter 12, the New Testament fulfillment. All of these prophecies about God establishing the mountain of his house and filling the earth with this great mountain. Well, Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 22, after describing the scene at Mount Sinai and the terror and the fear among all the Israelites. By contrast, he says in chapter 12 and verse 22, but you haven't come to Mount Sinai, but you have come to Mount Zion. So he's bringing it into the first century to the church, to the believers of Jesus, to us today. This is what we have come to. Zion did reference Jerusalem literally in Old Testament times, but it also foretold a greater reality. Not a literal mountain, but the mountain of prophecy. We have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. So here's where we wrap up the lesson. All those principles we saw about mountains, all those things that make mountains so unique and so important and so significant, they're true of our God today and of the kingdom which He has established, of which we are citizens of. In God and in His kingdom, we find refuge. I'm still open in Hebrews. I'm just going to back up to chapter 6 and verse 18. It says that by two immutable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. Similarly, Jesus would say, take my yoke, for my burden is easy and my yoke is light. I want to be a refuge to you. I want to remove the burden of sin from you. We find refuge from sin and death in the Lord's mountain. It is still a place of safety. It is still a place of security where we find rest. And I'll say this, I don't know what you've got going on in your life, what things might be distressing, concerning to you. But when I come here on Sunday, this is my place of refuge among God's people with our attention on our God. And it is a place where we can put aside what is troubling us. We can find courage to face those challenges throughout the week because we come to this great place of refuge. And I'm so thankful that it is a great mountain, and mountains don't change. This is always our place of refuge from the world, is on God's holy mountain. It is still a source of strength. We find strength, as we talked about a couple Sundays ago, 2 weeks ago, we talked about our adversary, the devil. 1 Peter chapter 5 says that in God, we find the strength to resist him. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon Him, for He cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. But may the God of all grace, who called us to His eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered a while, perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. We still find strength in God. He is still our high ground. When we are in the Lord, when we are on His mountain, when we are in His kingdom, He is our refuge, but He is also our high ground, our place of advantage, our strength. And we are near to God. This mountain, His kingdom, the church, His people, we are near to God. In Hebrews chapter 10, it says in verse 19, therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which He consecrated for us, through the veil, that is His flesh, and having a high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. One of the things that impressed me the most after studying through Hebrews last semester was just the kind of access that Jesus gives us to the Father. Under the law of Moses, well, you can go back to Moses himself. Moses, you go up to the mountain. We don't want to go near. Moses had that incredible experience, but he was the only one. And then you look at the system, the law delivered by Moses. What kind of access? They had great access compared to the rest of the world, but compared to us today, you have the tabernacle or eventually the temple. One person gets to go in one room one day a year to offer a sacrifice before the presence of God. Now that was greater than access than any other nation at the time, but we read this here and we have bold confidence to come before the throne of grace. We have this unlimited access to be nearer to God because of the work of Jesus. And finally, it provides clarity. As Paul was retelling his conversion story, he talks about his calling and his mission as an apostle. Summarizing his work, he says in chapter 26 and verse 18, Jesus said, your role, Paul, your mission is to go to Gentiles, to open their eyes in order to turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Simply put, This is where we find clarity with God. The world offers confusion. The world looks for purpose. The world looks for meaning. And we find that in God. I'll leave you with this message as we prepare to sing the invitation song. Those who trust in the Lord, disappeared on my screen. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken, but endures forever. I am so grateful that we have an unchangeable God who is a mountain, who is strong, powerful, gives us a place of refuge and security and strength, offers us clarity, and is unchangeable like the mountains around us. If He is not your great God, if you do not have that strength, that clarity, that access and nearness through the blood of Jesus, we'd love to encourage you to make some changes in your life. And if we can help you on that path, we invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing. Thanks for listening to the Clovis Church of Christ Sermon Podcast. For more information, please visit us at clovischurchofchrist.org.